Okay, so we'll begin. This is Authenticating to Google Data Services, and I am Jeff Fisher. Our other speaker today is Jeff Scudder, and we also have a special guest speaker from Salesforce, Bing Yang. So, well, actually, before we even get to that, how many people here have played around with one of the data APIs already? So calendar, text, ooh, quite a few of you, okay. How many of you have used AuthSub as your mechanism for doing the authentication? Okay, not as many. Client login a little bit more popular. So how many of you who have done AuthSub have actually done secure AuthSub and registered and everything? Okay. So that's a little bit more challenging, and it's good that you're here because we're going to dive into all the ins and outs of what's complicated and what's hard. So I know this is one of the last sessions, and it's been kind of a long day. It's a lot of excitement, a lot of different sessions, and there's a lot of sessions going on at the same time. So I'm a little touched that you chose my session over someone else's, so thank you. And in return for your loyalty, I'll give you 2 secrets during this talk. The first secret, which you may not know, is this shirt is actually ASCII, so like 010001, and it's GOOGLEIO. So very cute. You might not have noticed that. We thought it was random originally, but there is a method to our madness, as you will hopefully decide. So first off, the big picture, the 30,000-foot view. If you remember nothing else from this talk except for this, remember that user consent is represented by a token. Now, what does that mean? Well, first off, why are we using tokens? Why don't we just use the user's credentials themselves? We have HTTP basic auth. We could just use that, encrypt the username and password somehow. Well, the problem with using user credentials is that they can get stolen and then they can be reused by anyone because they are the username and password, and that's not always very easy to reset. The user doesn't want to come up with a new password. I personally don't come up with passwords all the time. I'm bad like that. So a lot of other users do that too. So if we're using a token, which is just an arbitrary string of characters, it's separated from the user's actual credentials, and it can be revoked, and it can be used in a fashion that protects their account and their data without giving away the keys to the castle. So when we say user consent is represented by a token, it means that this user, any user who's using a Google service, for example, can grant your application access to their data that's stored in Google services by use of a token, and it's a limited lease that they can revoke at any time. So it makes them feel a little bit safer too. So the goals and motivations about what we had in mind when we were designing these different authentication mechanisms. Well, first off, like I said, we really want to protect the user's credentials. We want their accounts to remain secure. We want their data to remain private. And I'm sure you all want your users to feel secure when they use your programs too. So we also wanted to make sure that there is user awareness of data access. So it's not just, I'm typing in my username and password into this program. Who knows what it's accessing in my account? We want it to be very clear that your application is requesting access to a user's spreadsheets or documents, or the canonical example we're going to be using for this demonstration, this talk, is going to be the Contacts API, which, if you're not aware of it, allows you to get access to the user's contact list inside of Gmail. So the last thing is some safeguards against malicious middlemen, and what that means is if there happens to be, however it occurs, someone between your server, your code, and the API, that your requests can be made securely, and those tokens, even if stolen, could not be useful to attack your users, and we'll talk about how you can do that with secure AuthSub later. So, as I've sort of alluded to, we have many different authentication mechanisms, and it's not to confuse you. They have different use cases, and they have different history behind them. The first one is client login. And client login is really intended to be something that lives on an application that's installed on a piece of hardware a user owns. So like their personal computer, a Windows application that lives on their desktop, or a Mac widget, or a cell phone app that lives locally on their phone. And the reason for that is because it actually does deal with the user's credentials. And so if you're going to cache that, locally is better than in the cloud, since the user's device has some security, even though it could be stolen, but maybe it has a secure fashion to save those credentials, like the Mac keychain. AuthSub sidesteps the issue of, what do I do if I have a web application and I want to have a user sign in? Well, I don't want to touch the credentials because I don't want to deal with the security implications, and maybe a user won't try my app even if I require them to enter their username and password because they don't trust me. How do I get around that? Well, the answer with AuthSub is you don't bother to log them in. Instead, you redirect them to Google, where they sign into the usual Google-branded page, which they know and trust and love, and they're able to enter their credentials and then get redirected back to your site and take part in whatever experience you want to create for them. And the last one, OAuth, is sort of taking AuthSub further in that it's a standard for doing authorization on the web, which many different companies can implement and are implementing, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So the first one that we're going to talk about is client login. That is the most basic one, hence it's first, but it should not be first in your hearts because AuthSub is better, as we'll get to that. So like I said, it's for installed applications because you can't always do a browser redirect. If you have a cell phone, there are latency and bandwidth issues, and the cell phone browsers, quite frankly, aren't that great. They don't all have WebKit and all the fancy things that are coming down the line. So the user enters their credentials into this application, and you get back a token. And this token then is used to access their data that is stored with Google. And this token, however, is not indefinite, and it will expire after a period of time, which can range between 1 day or several weeks, or sometimes longer, depending upon what service you're using. But you won't know exactly, you can tell when the token expires, but you won't know exactly when that will happen. It will also expire if the user changes their password as a security precaution. So if I'm a developer, what do I need to know about client login? Well, you're going to be making an HTTPS post request, so a secure post, to a Google service with the username and password, and you're going to be passing along a service name that identifies what API you're trying to access. So if this is contacts, you're going to say, I want to access the contacts API by passing the service name for contacts. And you're going to get back this token directly from Google. Now, the one nit that no one really realizes at first is that you might have to solve a CAPTCHA. Well, what is a CAPTCHA? If you're not familiar, CAPTCHA is a really long acronym. It stands for Completely Automated Public Turing Test to Tell Computers and Humans Apart. Not only is it really long, but it's also trademarked by Carnegie Mellon, so I think you have to say TM afterwards, but I'm not going to. So a CAPTCHA is those little images you see when you try to do something on a website and it wants to make sure that you are not a robot, so you're not spamming them or whatnot. And we use it for Google accounts to prevent people from trying to guess your password by brute force. So if they make a program that tries to log in 1,000,000 times to your Gmail account, you get this little box that says, oh, solve this, because you might be a robot trying to break in. And similarly, when you try to log into our APIs using client login, you might be issued a similar challenge where your code then gets back an image URL and it has to display this to the user. And there's other complications because there might be accessibility concerns, so there's other links. And it's a whole process that you probably don't want to have to replicate in every application. So if you use AuthSub, you won't have to deal with that. But before we get to AuthSub, I just want to illustrate how client login works. And these are beautiful charts made with DIA, if you're wondering. So the user visits your application and says, oh, gee, application, I want to use your functionality. How do I do this? You interact with my Google account. I see, well, I have to enter my credentials, I guess. So they enter their credentials into their mobile phone or whatnot, which is not an easy task, mind you. And the application then is able to request the token from Google. And then once it has this token, everyone's happy. The application is able to interact with the user. The application is able to interact with Google. The user's data is able to be accessed by the application, modified by the application on behalf of the user, and we have a nice, rich experience. So what does this actually look like? Well, when you're doing the post, like I said, it's just to an HTTPS URL, and it's form URL encoding. So if you're familiar at all with HTML forms, this should be rather familiar to you. So you're passing a number of parameters, and they're not all as important. The first one, account type, you'll see is hosted or Google. That's from a quirk where if you are signed in with the Google Apps account, like for a specific domain, what you could actually do, and it will confuse you in the end, is you can register app's domain account as a normal Google account, and then which one are you trying to log in as? It might not be clear. So you could say account type equals hosted, and this one will try hosted, and if it fails, try Google, like a regular Google account. So it's usually the default one. So then we pass along the username, which is an email address, and the password. And then we pass along a service name. In this case, CP is for contacts, because like I mentioned earlier, we're trying to request a list of a user's contacts from Gmail. And the last thing is an example source string, which is just to identify your program in our log, so we can see, oh, it's supposed to be company name dash application name dash 2. So if we notice cool companies, awesome app, version 5 is really popular. I don't know. It's not really used for anything in particular, but it is useful in terms of being able to see the adoption of our APIs. So what you get back from doing this post is a bunch of key value pairs, and it's just plain text. So you have SID, LSID, and those mean nothing. You can forget those. I'm not 100% sure why we provide them, but they're there. What you're really interested in, what you need to have, is this auth equals business, because the other part of that equal sign is that token. And what do you do with this token? Well, you use it in your authorization header when you're accessing one of the feeds in our APIs. So you construct a special authorization header that passes a token along, and you're able to retrieve the feed. In this case, that is the contacts feed. And voila, I have a nice Atom feed that contains Atom entries of all of the contacts for this user I'm authenticated as. So if we understand client login, we also know from our earlier talk about what our goals and motivations were that it's not the most robust mechanism because we're still handling user credentials. It's not as secure. The user might not feel as comfortable. We really want to protect the user's data and their experience. So we have AuthSub as a remedy for this, and it's because web applications can use it very easily, we recommend that they all do use it. And you never have to ask the user for their password or their username even, because you just are able to redirect them to a Google branded page, and you get back, in the end, another token. The difference is that this token can be very long-lived. It can be what's called a session token. And that way you can store this token in your database in plain text and not feel bad about it, because it's representing this connection that your application has to this user's data in a particular, on their Google account, in a particular service. I'm sorry, what was the question?
If anything, keeps a website from using client login anyway, despite the fact that there's...
Okay, that's a good question. And we'll have questions at the end too, but that's good. So the question was, what is to prevent a website from using client login anyway, like if they don't care to use this AuthSub process? Well, the bottom line answer is technically nothing. It's not easy to enforce this, but I do think that it provides a much better user experience from peace of mind to see the Google branded page, and we strongly encourage anyone who is currently using client login to migrate to AuthSub, especially because, as I will share in a later secret, there is now some incentive to do so, besides the fact that it's just more clear to the user. So they can be long-lived, so you can store them and be a good netizen for that. So what do you need to know if you're a developer? Like I said, you're going to do 2 redirects. You're going to redirect the user to Google's login page, and then once the user has approved access, they are going to be redirected back to your web application. So because of this, you need some web accessible endpoint, which will be passed in through a parameter called next. Now, this usually is your application itself, since if it's a web app, it just redirects back with the token for you. But ostensibly, you could still build a client application that just redirected back to a page on your company's website that said, OK, close the browser, and your program can make a remote call back to your website and get the token from it that way. So you could still build a client application using AuthSub. It's just a little more footwork. So the last thing here is you need to know the scope. Scope is very similar to the service name that I mentioned before, in that it identifies what API you are trying to use, what data you're trying to request access to. Except scopes can be a little more fine-grained than that. You can request access just to a particular feed of an API, so if you only need to know some parts of a user's information and you don't need access to everything they have stored in one of the APIs like contacts, you can do that. And here's the other secret thing that you can do as of yesterday. Scopes can not only be granted for more specific URLs, they can be granted for multiple different feeds. So you can request one AuthSub token that will grant you access to multiple APIs. So you could, with one token, get access not only to users' Google contacts, but also to their calendar, also to their spreadsheets, and so on. So it's very useful because you can have one token you can store that represents a link between your web application and their data as stored in Google's services. So very cool. And if you didn't understand why that was such a big deal, it's because previously, since you have to do this whole redirect business, as you might imagine, someone who wanted to integrate with multiple Google services would have to do this redirect multiple times, which is just generally not a very good user experience. And if you're really curious, since I don't think this is quite documented yet, the way that you create multiple scope tokens is just by including a percent encoded space between each scope, so %20 in that case. So what does this look like? What is the flow? Well, again, a user is visiting your glorious application and wants to take advantage of whatever service you provide, maybe a fancy visualization done in Flash, let's say. And this time, instead of typing in their credentials into your program, we're going to forward them on to Google, where they might have to log in. And here's the kind of the magical part. If they're already logged in, they won't have to even do that, so it's a lot more seamless. And so they see this approve access page instead, and they have to say, OK, I trust this site. And then we redirect back to your application. And then here's the extra step. As I mentioned, there's a long-lived session token that gets involved here. And the token you get back initially is sort of a one-time use token, which you have to then upgrade to a session token. But once you've done that, and that's pretty easy to do, you get your token that you can store forever. And that way you are now tied to the user's Google account in a way, and you can keep accessing their data whenever they return to your site if you stored that in a database. And then once again, we're here at the end where everyone's happy, everyone's interacting, and the user experience is great. They're using your application, which is using their data, and everyone's pleased. So what does this look like? Well, first we have to construct this redirect link to the AuthSub page. And there are a number of parameters that let you customize what happens here. The first one, of course, is next. That's what website you want them to be sent back to with the token when they're done approving it. The second one is scope. And like I said, that identifies what API you want to work with. And then session equals 1. That means we want a long-lived token that doesn't expire. And the last one, secure. Right now we're doing 0 because I'm trying to keep this simple initially just to introduce you to it. But the next part of our talk, we'll talk about secure AuthSub and how we can prevent man-in-the-middle attacks and replay attacks and all those wonderful things. So what does this link actually look like on your website? Well, you can integrate it however you want. You can just do a redirect if that's your thing. But usually you want to do some sort of link displayed on their accounts page, or in some cases a button. This is what Flickr did to tie into the contacts API. And they'll get taken to this request page, and you notice there's a big yellow warning box there because we're not doing this securely yet, but that will be dealt with later, like I said. The user approves, and then at the bottom, if you can see that down there, we're getting back a token in a query parameter, which is imaginatively named token. Who would have thought? So that's the one-time use token, which we then have to upgrade. We do that just by doing a get to another URL with another appropriately formed authorization header, which you might think is a little bit different than client login, and it is. So then you get back, again, key value pairs, token equals, and there is your long-lived token that you want to store. And there we can now make a request to the feed. We can make requests to the feed again and again, reusing this token since it doesn't expire. Now the token can still be revoked either by your application or by the user in their Google Accounts management page. So it will persist until it is revoked generally. So that in mind, if you've followed us till now, the next thing we have to talk about, welcome to the stage, my friend and coworker, Mr. Jeff Scudder. He's going to tell you all about secure AuthSub and how you can do even more things to protect the security of user data.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, so you've just seen the flow that the user is taken through, where they have redirects and things like that for AuthSub, and what they get back is this token that then you're sending right in all of your requests. Now that token is sent in plain text, right? It's out there for everyone to see. Maybe your ISP is seeing what's being sent across the wire, or maybe you're on wireless and everybody at Starbucks is watching what you're sending across. But you know, I don't know, something like that. So there are opportunities where these tokens could potentially be intercepted and reused by people, right, to access your data. They could, you know, pretend to be this other application and access your data. So the way that we protect against this is we allow you to do registration, where we register your domain that you're requesting your redirect to, you know, that next parameter. We've verified that this particular person owns this domain, and also we allow you to give us a key pair, which will let you do secure digital signatures so that you can sign the requests in a way that no one else can impersonate. So what we're preventing here is even if someone is able to find the token as it's being sent across the wire, to prevent them from being able to use it because it you know, requires them to construct a cryptographic signature, which is secure and extremely difficult to impersonate. So I've mentioned that we're going to be using digital signatures, and I wanted to briefly talk about asymmetric cryptography. It's a larger topic than we really have time for to talk about in this forum, but the basic idea is that when you're using asymmetric cryptography, you have two keys. You have a key that's used for encoding or encrypting the data so that no one else can read it, unless they have this other key, which is used for decrypting or decoding the data. And this is done in a mathematical way so that these two keys are not really guessable from one another. They're completely separate. They can only be used, one for encoding, one for decoding. So we call these public and private keys. The idea is that you give one of these keys to everyone in the entire world and just put it out there for anybody to use. But you maintain the other key so that only you, in the case of digital signatures, can encrypt the data, and you let anybody else decrypt it. The idea is that if they can decrypt the data with the key that they expect to be able to decrypt it to, that means it must have been encrypted with your key. Hopefully everyone follow that. Okay. So the idea is that only you can generate this signature, and then you're allowing Google to verify that it was you that got that signature. So the whole point of this is verification, that the request did actually come from your application. You know, it was really your code that requested this, not someone who had somehow obtained this token as it was flying by. So let's look a little bit at how you could get started with this process, right? I mentioned that you need to have a key pair, a public and a private key. And there are numerous tools, some open source tools, for example, that will allow you to generate these keys. One of my favorites to use is OpenSSL. So I've included here a command line call to generate an RSA key, which would be usable with these Google services. What you're interested here is creating these PEM files. These contain the key in a format that's usable by Google and actually lots of different services. If you're working in a particular language, chances are there's probably a library in that language that will allow you to use these PEM files as, you know, input to read in your key and then generate the signatures for you. So once you have these PEM files, these two keys, I'm going to walk you through the registration process. So the first thing to do is register your web apps domain with Google. We have an account registration page. So you're going to add a domain, and then the next step is to verify it. So the idea is we don't just let anybody verify the domain. The idea is that you have to demonstrate that, you know, the same person who's going through this process of verifying the domain registration, you know, has the ability to modify or somehow prove ownership of that domain. So one of the ways you can do that is to upload an HTML file, for example, with a very specific name which Google generates. It's, you know, randomized, hard to guess. So the idea is that you create a page and put it at the root of your domain that's called, it's that bold URL down there at the bottom, that bold page. So once you do that, we ping that address and Google verifies that that file has been added to the domain, and you can proceed. The next step is we have you agree to terms of service, and then you upload your certificate. So this is how Google knows the public key, which is used to decrypt all of these requests that you're sending, to decrypt the signatures and be able to match up with what it expects to see. So once you've gone through this process, you can see all along here we've had this inactive text up at the top, and now registration is complete, and we say that your domain is active. Registration is active, so you're ready to start using these secure requests. So how is it that you really sign a request, right? I've mentioned that you're going to be sending some encrypted stuff, and Google is going to be decrypting it. Well, how does it know what it's really looking for? So anytime you make a request, we have a specific format that we ask for, which we call the request message, which is a specific string that contains information. The first part is the HTTP verb that you're using, right? With Google Data Services, you're doing either a get, post, put, or delete. And then we have the full URL that you're trying to access with that data. Then we include a timestamp to identify, when this request was made, and then a nonce. So the timestamp is to prevent replay attacks later on, and the nonce allows you to randomize your requests to, ensure that each one is unique, right? So you want to use a truly random number to make sure that, this can't be replayed. So now if we take this whole message here, you can see down at the very bottom, we're using a longer authorization header. If you were to, the example here is get a list of the user's contacts out of Gmail. Before we showed that it was just authorization authsub and then the token. Well, here we're adding a couple new things. We're including this data string, which you can see at the top, and it has the 4 parts to it. And then we're including this signature, which is that data transformed and digitally signed. And we also have you specify which signature algorithm you're using so that we can decrypt it and reconstruct what the data should have been. So the first thing you're going to do, since this is an RSA SHA-1 signature, the first thing you're going to do is hash the data. And after you've hashed that data into a fixed length, you're going to perform a signature. You're going to use your private key to digitally encrypt and sign that data right there, the hashed data. Then, since this is included in an HTTP header, right, the signature is usually, hexadecimal binary data. We want to include it in a format that's friendly for HTTP headers. So we use base64 encoding to turn it into alphanumeric characters represented as alphanumeric. So the idea then is when the server receives this, it looks at that signature field, it decodes the base64, it uses your public key, which you've registered with Google, to decrypt this, and then it hashes the data that it sees in the request and makes sure that the two match. So we have our signature, which we then include. So if all of this sounds a little bit difficult and complicated, whether it's the secure AuthSub or just regular AuthSub or client login, there are a set of client libraries which we provide, which Google provides in a number of languages. And if you're particularly interested in using secure AuthSub, the Java and the .NET library currently support those, and support in the other libraries is still coming. But so you don't have to start from scratch. There's a good foundation, especially if you're working in these languages. In other languages, there might be other open source libraries too. I'm not aware for sure of some of them. Now at the beginning, we talked about another option specifically for accessing your Google contacts. So another way of doing authorization is using OAuth. So OAuth is an open standard which is being developed by a group of companies all working together on this. You can actually see their work. There's a specification out on oauth.net with more information on how to get involved in the community, things like a wiki. There's a lot of great resources there. But the idea is that this is an approach which looks quite a bit like AuthSub, but it's going to be used by multiple different people, multiple different websites. So if you build your application to use this mechanism, the idea is that you can reuse all of this code, and whether you're talking to Google or Yahoo or MySpace or AOL or a number of different service providers, lots of different people who are getting involved and say that they want to support this OAuth mechanism for, again, the same idea of obtaining a token to represent user consent to access data that's stored on these servers. So the way that this works, if you're using OAuth, the high-level view, the way it looks for developers, if you're interested in writing the application, is the first thing for Google specifically is that for OAuth, we require registration. So all of our requests, if you're using OAuth with contacts, need to be done with the RSA SHA-1 pair of to do the signatures. The next thing you're going to do is make a secure GET request to achieve a token. And this is a request token. The idea with the request token is this is a request up front for authorization. So you get this token and you include this token when you send the user in that redirect over to sign in with Google, for example, and to authorize the application. So we also allow you to provide, similarly, a next URL to redirect back after the user has approved this request token. And then your application is going to take that request token and exchange it for an access token, which is similarly long-lived. So next, now that I've talked about these three auth mechanisms, we're going to bring up Bing from Salesforce, who has used these mechanisms and specifically talk about how they used AuthSub in some unique ways. So.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, thank you. Hi again, my name is Bing Yang. I'm a software developer at Salesforce.com. And I'm going to share a little bit about what we do and some of the partnering that we've been doing with Google. And specifically, I'll be showing you a demo of how we use AuthSub in our CRM application. For those of you that don't know about us, we are the world leader in on-demand enterprise applications. Our CRM, our customer relationship management software, has over 1 million paying subscribers. And more than that, we are now a full application development platform. So third-party developers like yourselves can build your code, you can design your UIs, and you can create your database and host them all on Salesforce.com servers. Part of our platform strategy is to partner with other cloud computing leaders like Google. And to that end, last month we announced a collaboration between Salesforce and Google called Salesforce for Google Apps. On one hand, it's a number of integrations through Google's data APIs between our CRM application and Google Apps. On the other hand, it's an opportunity for software developers to combine the power of the Force.com platform and Google's applications through the GData APIs to create a brand new class of enterprise computing software. So when we were designing this integration, two of the key challenges we had were how are we going to allow Salesforce.com users to authorize access for us to perform actions within their Google accounts? And on top of that, how can Force.com developers who are building applications in Salesforce.com servers also use AuthSub? So I'm going to show you a little demo of how we tied CRM app using secure AuthSub. All right, look how secure my CRM system is. It doesn't even let me in. So if you just bear with me for a second, I have some technical difficulties, but it'll just take a minute to get around it. Sorry about that, guys. So what I'm doing here is logging into my CRM application. Let's pretend I'm a sales representative for my company. And let's imagine I just got off the phone with my account, Pyramid Construction. I got off the phone with one of the contacts there, and they'd like me to draft a contract for the next fiscal year. So one of the integrations we built into our CRM app is the ability to create a document within my Google Docs account through Google's Document List API and to associate it directly to the record that I'm looking at. All right, I'm going to unblock my pop-ups. And the first thing you'll see is that Salesforce has sent me directly to Google's AuthSub facility. Even though I'm typing in my password here, I'm on a Google-branded page. I know that I'm providing my username and password to Google and to Google only. And here you see the access request page, the page that I give my consent for Google to issue a token over to Salesforce.com. Unlike the screenshot you saw before, there's no scary yellow box. Rather, there's some nice reassuring wording that Salesforce is registered to make secure requests with Google. So I know that Salesforce and only Salesforce will be and can be using my token. And what's going on behind the scenes over here is that Google just sent me a token, sent Salesforce a token. Salesforce stores that in their database so that now the identity of the Salesforce user that's logged in is tied to an authorization consent within their Google account. And I went through, I created a document through Google's client libraries. And if I swing back over to Salesforce, you'll notice that that document I just created is associated to my record as well. And the good thing is, because these tokens persist and I have them stored in my database, the next time I want to go through this flow, I go straight to my spreadsheet and no AuthSub is required. So the second challenge we faced was how can we allow our Force.com developers to also use AuthSub for their hosted apps. So here we have Salesforce.com servers which are hosting our CRM application as well as any Force.com app that you can dream of and build up. And all of those servers are registered to perform secure AuthSub. So what if I have, so one of the tenets of secure AuthSub, if you caught it in the screenshots that Jeff showed before, is that Google will only issue a secure token to a single endpoint. So what if I have a Force.com developer who's built their app, is currently hosting it on Salesforce.com, but this app is accessible at a completely different URL? How are they going to get a token? So what we've built is kind of some multi-purposeness into our endpoint. I mentioned before that in the demo, when Salesforce.com received the token, it's stored in the database for use downstream. We also built in the ability to accept an additional parameter to our endpoint in the form of a URL. If we detect that you passed us a URL, rather than storing the token and going along into one of our flows, we'll actually redirect to that URL and pass the token to you. So a Force.com developer can really use this as a routing mechanism to get the token exactly where they want. If you're interested in seeing an example of how we use this technology, you can check it out at code.google.com. And also myself and some other Salesforce.com developers will be hanging out at the campground. So that's the end of my presentation, and I think we have time for some questions. I'll invite the Jeffs back up.
Thanks. Sure. See how okay, we have audio. Awesome. So we have plenty of time for questions, and anything we've talked about today here is fair game. We're also, Jeff and myself, we're very familiar with the different data APIs, so if you have any questions with those, feel free. We have microphones here and here, if you want to step up.
One thing that struck me listening to you, I hadn't realized before, but it sounds to me like a site could completely offload all user authentication to Google and not even manage usernames and passwords themselves. Just say, just get the token from Google to find out if the user's registered and to keep track of who they are.
The use case you were referring to is usually commonly called single sign-on. And while you could theoretically do something like that using the mechanisms we described here today, like AuthSub or OAuth, it's not really intended for that purpose because it doesn't really establish the user's identity at all. I mean, it's a token, but there could be another token that grants access to the same data, so you don't really know concretely what user you're identifying there. So I think the ideal solution, what you're really looking for, is some way to identify this user without having to build that mechanism into your website. And that's something, that's an area that we're aware of and that the accounts team is working to solve.
Yeah, so one of the potential problems, like, this token is long-lived, so you would think, well, I could store that and just use that and associate it with, for identity. But the problem is that token can be revoked. And there are actually some cases in which we encourage users to revoke their tokens. Like if they have a very large number of them, we can send them to a page and say, why don't you, remove a few of these outstanding long-lived tokens that you have. So there are cases in which if you assume that this token is going to last forever, it will actually break.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's an area that we're very aware of, that people are interested in that sort of thing. We're looking at it. Next question, please.
Hi there. I'm just curious. I've heard from several people, including Google employees, that AuthSub is sort of discontinued. Is that incorrect?
Yes, that is incorrect. I mean, we are moving towards OAuth because it is a standard, and we believe that standards are a very good thing for the web in general. But we have no plans to deprecate the functionality of AuthSub. So if you have an existing application that is built on AuthSub, in the near term, you don't have to worry about anything. If at some point we were to deprecate it as an authentication mechanism, or an authorization mechanism, then we would have clear messaging far beforehand and give you plenty of time to migrate. So there's no near term, oh no, it's going away tomorrow to worry about. Does that answer your question?
And that's official?
Well,
I'm just curious because you could do all this stuff with AuthSub through OAuth, right? And if it's a superset, why even bother?
Well, yes, there is some overlap, but at Google, we're very sensitive, of course, to our developers' needs, and we are very aware that it's very painful to have to change your apps overnight because you might have your own release schedules, you have your own build schedules, and it's not. We're trying to be as fair as possible and set our APIs so that we don't have to do any drastic changes, and we are looking at plans. Like I can't say, of course, this is a guarantee, but I do think that it would be extremely against our best interest to do anything that would break the developer experience, and that we're being very cautious as we move forward to not do any backwards incompatible changes that people aren't well aware of beforehand.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. It's a good question. Yes, sir.
Hello. I'm a little bit afraid about unexperienced internet users. Why? If some user notice this page what the last speaker has showed us with this long URL and with a lot of technical stuff, I'm afraid that a lot of people will stop at this moment at least.
Oh, you're referring to on the approved page where it looked really long and scary?
Right.
Yeah, that's technically a formatting issue. Usually the URL isn't quite as long. Of course, they're doing some extra parameters, so it gets longer. So we're working on making the visual appearance a little bit safer. A little bit more clear as to what the user is granting access to. And because I mean, really, ideally what we want is some page that any normal Google account user can look at and say, okay, this program is really wanting to access these parts of my data that are stored in Google services. And I agree that there are definitely some improvements to the template that can be made, and we're looking at those.
I'm sure you're right for existing Google account users, because most of them are people like us. But if I think about people maybe a little bit older, with maybe just 2 years on the internet, they didn't know what a Google account is and why do they have to register one. And if I see people from the sales departments in companies using Salesforce software, often salespeople are not very technical or have experience on the internet. Next question for the same thing. This template, is this multi-language? Is also available in Dutch language, in German language, in all these languages? Or is it only English?
Yeah, it's localized. So, which one? Okay, so the top 40 languages, because it's the Google Accounts page, so it's localized to everything. So yeah, so that language should be translated into German or Czech.
And I can't edit this template, right?
Right, I mean, that's part of why perhaps that these templates are still having take time to evolve, is because it has to be translated and localized properly for right to left and all that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, good question though. So yeah, certainly that is another area of improvement. Is there another question?
Yes.
Yes.
So when you are signing the request, you had the timestamp in it. So does that mean my app and the other end at Google, they have to be time synchronized?
I don't think that, well, that's a good question actually. I think it's partly to identify based upon the requests you are making when the next request is coming in. Do you know any more about that?
Yeah, so can you repeat the question?
So his question was, it's a timekeeping question, right? So the timestamp is sent in epoch seconds, but I think it's UTC time. So it technically is synchronized, but I'm not sure how that interferes.
So your clock needs to be accurate, but we do have a 5-minute time slack, backwards and forward, so it doesn't have to be synchronized.
So what you're saying is it doesn't have to be exactly synchronized.
Right. So
right.
To repeat, yeah, it was a 5-minute window, 5 minutes, above or below the current time on a Google server is what we look for.
Yeah. So if you have a relatively synchronized clock, and it is UTC time.
So another question. So somebody can take that request and replay that, and that will, that exact same request which has been signed, and that replayed request will go through, right?
That's why we include the nonce, to avoid people replaying within that time frame.
Right. The nonce is a number used once. It's a big 64-bit unsigned integer.
So what you're saying is that the nonce should change with every
request.
request.
So if we notice the nonce doesn't change, even if everything is correct, like it's in the same time frame, we can say, oh, well, this request is wrong because they couldn't have made another request because it has the same supposedly random integer, right?
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Very good question. So yeah. So you can tell a lot of security folks have thought real hard about this.
So I wanted to go back to the question about the revoking of the token.
Okay.
So if our app actually submits with the given token and it's revoked, is there actually an error that can come back?
Right. So if you're using the raw protocol, there is a message you get back that will inform you that this token has been revoked, and so you can't use it. But if you're using one of the client libraries, like if you're using Java, for example, it'll even just give you an exception that you can catch and then handle. So in that case, you might catch that exception and then redirect them back to log in again if the token is no longer valid for some reason.
Okay, then I want to go back to the very first question about using your AuthSub as a way to sort of offload user accounting. So if you can actually detect this and then route the user back when you detect that it's been revoked, couldn't you do that?
You could, but here's the tricky part. Just because you're getting a new token, it's not guaranteed to be the same token. So if you're relying on that identifier, like in your database as a unique key to identify the user and their preferences or whatever data they have stored in your site, it will no longer be associated because maybe their second token they get back is slightly different alphanumeric stuff, and now they've lost all their site settings, which is not an ideal experience for you, because really what you want to get back is something that uniquely identifies this user however you attempt to do so. Like OpenID tries to do it by URL. Other sites just use some arbitrary string.
Okay.
But a token is not synonymous with a user. It is just a limited lease to a user's data, so it doesn't have the same properties you're looking for.
Okay, thanks.
Good question, though. Oh, we have another one.
So when I get a multi-use token, is there a way to limit the number of uses?
Currently, there is only a way to request a single-use token, which goes through the redirect process and then can be used only once, or a session token, which lasts indefinitely. You can, like I said, revoke a session token, but there's no way to specify, like, this token can be used 20 times or something like that. That could perhaps be a feature request.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Any more? Here we go.
Hi. So if I'm developing, let's say, a native mobile application or a browser toolbar, and I want to be a good developer and do the right thing and not store people's username and password on my application, how am I supposed to use secure AuthSub or OAuth if we're saying that the requests have to be signed with a private key, which I don't want to put in my toolbar because then that could be potentially reverse engineered?
You want to handle that one?
Yeah, so that's kind of a tough question. No, so the first option you could do is if you did want to use client login, right, there might be a way that you could store those credentials safely. Another option that might be possible is some things that we're putting out there that are designed for gadgets, right? And gadgets are a slightly different situation because they're usually embedded within a web page, so they don't have their own URL that they can be redirected to. But the idea is to do a proxied request with signing, so that your request can still be signed and secure. But there's the signature is applied for that individual gadget or smaller application. We might be able to go into more detail too. We're going to be out at the booth down the hall this way.
Tools and APIs.
Right. Yeah, and have quite a few people to talk specifics. But that is definitely a very interesting,
tricky situation.
Yeah,
I mean, the other thing you can do, like the reason really that this token can be intercepted is because when you're retrieving these feeds, you're not always doing so over SSL. Like you're not always making HTTPS requests. So, I mean, you could also build your own sort of proxy service similar to like how Salesforce did, where you can make SSL requests always to your own backend, which could then redirect and make the signed requests for you. That would be a little more work and obviously more bandwidth, but it's a very tricky situation.
So you mentioned that token is being stored in the local database by the applications, right?
I'm sorry, what was that?
So you mentioned that tokens are stored locally by each application that's been
right. So each
right?
application will receive this token back and it has to decide what to do with it, whether that's to save it like in a database or a user pref.
So what if that is compromised?
That's a good question. I mean, that's the point. Like, so say this token were to be stolen somehow. Like I were to sneak into your computer and grab this token. Now, if you're using like AuthSub, right, and it's not secure AuthSub, then you have all the rights and privileges that token normally grants, which may or may not be useful depending upon if you know who that user is. And you can still try to figure out, because you don't know just from the token what scope it's even for. So you'd have to try all the APIs and see if you could get a request to work. But if, for whatever reason, the user feels that their tokens have been compromised, like we've said, they can be revoked from a management page. But also, if you see signing, because we talked about this problem, signing works best with a web app because you can have this private key that lives on your server. And even if someone were to somehow intercept this token, they have no way of forging a signature without that private key. Obviously, if you have an embedded application, which, if you embed the private key, well, you don't really have the...
Yeah, it's sort of one of those situations where when you're working on a client on someone's computer, right, there's a lot of things that could be happening on that computer. It's very difficult to, protect that computer completely. So it's sort of one of those areas where the users installed the application on their computer. They trust it as much as any other application. I mean, you can...
Well, and also that I mean, that's sort of an operating system level thing too, right? Does the operating system of whatever device you're using provide some way to securely store that other applications can't steal credentials? I mean, it's a problem that really even goes beyond, you know, what our mechanism can provide. Since, I mean, if someone has unlimited access to a client machine that a program is running on, you know, it's hard to protect that.
Right, because their follow-up question is that Salesforce.com, he said that is persisting the token and also going to share it with downstream systems. Now, somebody could build an app in Salesforce.com who could misuse that token, right? If it's being passed down to downstream systems, how are we going to protect that?
So I'm sorry if I miscommunicated on that. We're not actually sharing our token or any of our registration information, including the private key. We're just, you know, what I introduced is just a way for us to route tokens to the right place, but they're not necessarily issued privately to Salesforce. That's something we're working on.
So yeah, they would be issued to the app, so you'd have to trust the app in that case to handle the token securely and do whatever with it. I mean, when you're approving the token, really what you're doing is telling this app that they have the right to, you know, access your data in a fashion, and you're trusting them not to just, you know, email that token to someone or whatnot, or abuse your data. It's the same situation as if you were to type your username and password. You know, it's at least nicer because I don't want to reset my username and password. I can revoke a token, but you're still trusting them with your data at the end of the day. And if they do something malicious with it, then, you know, hopefully they don't.
All right.
Is there any API to restrict access to a group of users, just like a normal login or registering of user management script? I know the Google Authentication that normally everyone is able to register some service, but what if only a few customers are able to register or having access to my web application? Is there some connection that I can automate the whole system? Or I need to ask the user first to register to my application, that I give him access and he can use the Google account afterwards to re-log in the next time?
Yeah, usually, sorry if I'm not understanding your full question correctly, but usually the flow in most websites is they've registered for your site, you know, they're a member of your website, and then you want to tie their account on your site to some data they have stored in Calendar or YouTube or wherever. And then you're going to, you know, do that linking process using AuthSub. And then once that's there, you know, you have that communication channel through the APIs that you can use. There is some tricky situations where if you try to do an AuthSub request to a service they might not have activated on that Google account, like because they have to click through like a little license agreement when they first sign into like Google Docs, for example. I think the sign-in page might be able to redirect them to that. But in terms of, I mean, there's not really an API that's not part of a publicly, like, you know, all the software that has APIs that have scopes that are used with AuthSub, you can use freely, I think. So you wouldn't get into too much trouble.
Okay.
But yeah, so in general, when you say like the user is usually aware that they need an account. It's like, you know, I have photos on Picasso web albums. You know, I want to pull those into your app, and so they're aware that they have to have that account.
You're right, but most of the web applications on the internet are not for the whole public. So actually, I have to give them access, and Google account is only using for re-login. But that makes no sense, because if I ask the customer to register on my website, he have to enter his login or maybe his password, or I give him a password, and he is able with his login credentials to access the site the next time. So I don't see a reason why I need to use the Google login.
I'm not sure well, okay. Obviously, you have a specific use case, and we could talk more at the booth because we're getting down to the last minute. So yeah, we'll talk more about that. Were there any like 30-second questions, 10-second questions? Okay, probably not. So like we've said before, we're going to be out at the Tools and APIs booth. I'll also be floating around the YouTube booth. That's what I do in my spare time. And yeah, this is Bing. So.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Oh yeah, and this is all on code.google.com. Make that your homepage. When was the t-shirt? When was the multi-scope?